Hey guys, I hope everyone's having a wonderful afternoon. I wanted to go over a couple of things with you guys that might be on the quiz, might be because they are, about this week, in which we're talking about states, regimes, and how we created the type of government we see in the United States today. A couple of things first to talk about is to be sure that we understand we have a representative democracy in the United States, a federal system of government in which power is divided between a higher level and a lower level of government. And they did that intentionally. The founding fathers, especially James Madison, in writing the Constitution, feared what they referred to as factions or factious behavior. And so you're going to be reading this week the Federalist Papers, and here's my copy of the Federalist Papers. Oops. You can tell it's from graduate school. It's got all these marks in it. And the Federalist Papers essentially were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay in an effort to convince the states to ratify the newly drafted Constitution. And they went out of their way to design the Constitution with a couple of unique features that exist to help protect government from tyranny of the majority, or from one particular branch of the government from getting too much power and taking over the rest. You'll know that we have three branches of government, and each of those branches have very separate and distinct functions, right? As articulated in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress can only do these things, and the rest of the responsibilities are left to the state. Moreover, we have checks and balances, right? Here's a quick picture of checks and balances. We know that each of these branches has a way in which it could check the power of other branches. And in Federalist number 10, they discuss why it is important to have checks and balances. Because man, in their very natural state, or in their state of nature, as it were, are self-interested and tend to accumulate more power once they have received power. And so just by the nature of man, each branch of government, like the legislative branch or executive, once they have a certain amount of power, is going to attempt to increase that. And similarly, other branches will as well. And in that strife for power, they will end up blocking themselves or checking ambition. Ambition is made to counteract ambition. It's really a unique thing. But in particular, there's another filter or medium, so to speak, that the founders embraced in an attempt to minimize factions or the tyranny of the majority, and that's written in Federalist Paper number 10. So I'm going to read to you from my Federalist number 10, and you can find the link to Federalist number 10 on Blackboard in week 3 module, and it discusses how they came about with the system of government that they have today. So a couple of things. James Madison writes, what even is a faction? When we look at, we say faction, what do we mean? And modern day people might say factions are similar to something like interest groups. So here's James Madison's understanding of factions. He writes, by faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority the whole, that are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion or interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens, or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And what that means is that a faction is essentially a group of people who come together specifically to seek their own self-interest, and that self-interest may or may not be in the best interest of the community in its entirety as a whole. They are only looking for their one particular interest. That group may be a majority, maybe it's a minority, it doesn't really matter, but they don't want that type of group existing in American society. People who run the government ought to be looking out for the general welfare of the community entirety rather than their singular narrow self-interest. So he continues, what can we do then about factions to make sure that they don't pose a threat to our newly formed democratic society in America? And he writes, there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of factions. That is, there's two ways to get rid of factions or to make sure that they aren't problematic in American society. The one by removing its causes, and the other by controlling its effects. So we have two things we could do. We can remove whatever it is that causes people to come together and form a faction, or control it. We're going to let them come together, but we have to minimize the effect or the influence that they'll have on government. So let's look at the first being removing the reason that they do it, the cause that factions form. There are two methods for removing the causes of factions. One, by destroying liberty, which is essential to its existence. That is, if we get rid of liberty, factions won't exist because factions rely on liberty, people's free will. The other, by giving every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests. The first one is a cure worse than the disease, which means if we got rid of liberty, that would be worse than the influence of factions. Having no liberty in American society is worse than if we had a prevalent factious society. So liberty is to factions what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires. Okay? So they cannot get rid of liberty because that would mean the demise of the entire society. It could not be less folly to abolish liberty, which is essential to political life, because it nourishes factions, than it would be to wish the annihilation of air, which is essential to life. If air was polluted, we can't just get rid of air because then we wouldn't be able to live. We can't get rid of liberty because then society wouldn't be able to live. The second is as impractical as the first would be unwise. The second, which is giving everybody the same interests, is as unpractical as it is to get rid of liberty. As long as the reason of man continues to be fallible, he is at liberty to exercise it. Different opinions will be formed. Okay? So people are endowed with differences. People are born with naturally different instincts. We can't give everyone the same interests and capabilities. That's just against human nature. Everybody is going to be different, right? And that's what is good about American society. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. We have to then form a government that protects people's liberty. Okay? So what do we do? There's a couple of things that we do. Let's see. Hold on just a moment. So what do we do? Two suggestions. First, we have a representative form of democracy, which is to say that we have enlightened statesmen, as James Madison calls it, enlightened statesmen to represent people in government. We elect representatives, or people who are able to filter out their self-interest, to represent us in Washington. And in that way, it's a democracy because we are all electing those officials to go represent us. But it is a representative democracy in that they will go to Washington to represent us. And secondly, and this is very important, is that they believe that we need to institute a system of federalism to extend the scope of society or extend the sphere of influence. So there's two layers now. A federal society, or federalism, is the division of governmental structure into two levels. A higher level like the federal government and lower level like the states. And that can actually even be broken down more from the states down to cities, municipalities. Okay? The system in which governmental powers are divided between a central government and smaller state governments. And there's very little sharing of responsibilities as much as they have very separate functions. We know that there's reserved powers that are reserved to the states, and concurrent powers, some powers that both the state and the federal government have, as well as powers that are expressed to the government. And each of them has a different kind of jurisdiction. This is contrary to different other forms of governments, like unitary systems of government, which generally have one centralized control and it trickles down, which you'll read about in this chapter. So, moving forward, it's important. The founders felt that this type of government, federal government, was very important because it distributes the power. Okay, states don't have too much power, whereas the federal government doesn't have too much power. And it's important for the federal government not to have power because some things are better handled locally, right? The federal government may not have the capacity or the means to help a small individualized project in a very secluded place of Texas. Likewise, maybe the needs of California or New England are substantially different. And so in that way, the federal government won't have to neglect certain other duties to go take care of these very small needs for a very small group of people. They can rely on the states to do that. In fact, they referred to the states as laboratories of democracy. So, for instance, I think it was Montana or Wyoming practiced certain types of law. They were the first state to allow women the right to vote years before the federal government did. And so the states are able to act as a laboratory to test new policies and new ways of governing and see if it's successful at the state level. They can then be implemented at the federal level for all 50 states. You'll see that now going on with marijuana. It started in just a select few states, the use of recreational or medicinal marijuana. They were able to see the success of it, and that is now being replicated in other states and maybe someday the federal government. And there's plenty of other examples. But in this way, federalism and states can be referred to as a laboratory of democracy because they're able to experiment in a much more narrow capacity than if the federal government did. Okay? Some other systems of government that I discussed just a second ago: unitary. That's going to be where you have a strong national government and the power at low level is very specifically prescribed. So you'll remember that the United States derives power from the consent of those being governed. We, the people, give the government the ability to govern, right? And on unitary systems, the other way around. The federal government gives anything that they give comes straight down from the federal government. If you have responsibilities, it's because it was given to you. So instead of a trickle up, it comes down. And then there's a confederation, and this is very much equality among the different states. So you'll remember the first system of government in the United States was the Articles of Confederation, in which everyone acted very much independent, much more autonomous. There was a very weak federal government, and it was more member states. Something like the EU would be a great example of that also. And then there's our federal system of government. There's also implied powers, which we know is a way in which the federal government is able to accumulate more power than the expressed powers in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 through 17. The government has the powers necessary and proper to execute any one of the expressed powers. Okay, let me move past here. You guys can read on. So generally, states have a lot more individualized attention to the person. They're able to issue things that are very intimate to an individual's life. Most of the laws and regulations and policies that you're going to have affecting your daily life come from state-level politics rather than the federal government. Federal laws tend to be much more broad. They tend to only affect, excuse me, businesses, corporations, and the federal government itself. And so the last thing that I want to talk about here is the different evolutions of federalism. Federalism was established when we ratified the Constitution, but it has not been stagnant. It's a constant battle for power. Does this power belong to the state? Does this power belong to the federal government? And it has shifted drastically since the inception of the United States. At the founding time, it was very state-centered. We had a lot of Supreme Court rulings that established a very strong state-centered government. And then we had a shift when we had dual federalism during the Civil War, followed by a very large upheaval of federal power during the New Deal and the works programs associated with the New Deal, in which they refer to it as cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism. And that's because the federal government worked very closely implementing different policies and programs at the state level. And so it's similar to when you see a marble cake and you see the different chocolate and vanilla layers working together. The federal government often started programs and had them implemented at the state level, and they would work together in that way. And so it was very cooperative. This, under LBJ, shifted into more centralized federalism, in which the federal government started taking more control over things and relinquishing the power from the states. And it was very unpopular because the federal government started doing something called unfunded mandates, in which the federal government would require that states act in a certain way, but didn't provide them any kind of monetary compensation for that. So something like the federal government would require that they implement handicapped capabilities or handicap accessibility in all buildings, but they didn't provide them any money to help them fund that project. So it was very unpopular. During cooperative federalism prior to that, they would use block grants in which states and local businesses would compete for the contract. So, for instance, the Hoover Dam. The federal government said, we want to build a dam, so whoever can bid on the lowest cost will get that contract and will provide them a big chunk of money or a block grant to implement that program that we have, that project. So the Great Society under LBJ was pretty controversial, but under Nixon they started a system of what's called devolution. Started under Nixon, it really increased under the Reagan administration, and that was when they would systematically try and give rights back to the states. Things that used to belong to the federal government now belong strongly to the states. So, shifting gears here from federalism, we know that the federal system of government, or the federal regime, is a separation of powers between a higher and lower branch of government in order to prevent any one particular branch from gaining too much influence and too much power. And that was again articulated in James Madison's Federalist number 10 in the Federalist Papers, which you'll read. Also, I have uploaded what's called Federalist Papers translated into modern language, because this was written, a long time ago, and so some of the wording is a little bit dense. It's a bit of a dense book. It's very good if ever you have a chance to go through it. There's lots of them. There's 87, I think. But it's a little difficult of a read. You have 3 chapters to do today, so I went ahead and posted that. I do really quickly want to show you this one particular Aristotle's, oops, what did I do? Different regimes. That was way too much of me. So, we remember Aristotle. He was doing both descriptive and normative discussion of how a government ought to look and how it actually does work, both describing how it is and normative, or how it ought to be. But he articulates this really great chart of the different types of regimes that could exist, and what he refers to as a perversion of their own. So you'll see here, there's the normal rule, and then if that is perverted by one's own self-interest, in particular the self-interests of rulers. So if you have a regime that is being ruled by a single person, an honorable person, it's called a monarchy. But if that monarch abuses their power, it'll turn into a tyranny. Okay? If there are several, if it's a few, like a group of people with virtuous attributes, that can be considered an aristocracy. But if those attributes become very predominant and perverted into something like wealth, accumulation of wealth to one particular group of people, it could be considered an oligarchy. Okay? And then if you have rule by many, you can refer to it as a polity. And you'll see that the perverted version of polity is a democracy. And that's because you have to remember the time. At this time, you could refer to a democracy as like a mobocracy, having everybody compete, too many cooks in the kitchen. Everyone's interests are clashing, and it's very difficult to get things done. They have too much freedom to do their own thing. And so when you ask Aristotle, what is the best type of government? What kind of government should we do here to have a successful government? He's not going to say any one of these is good. He's going to say it needs to be a mixture, a hybrid, a little bit of each. We need to have a single person in charge that also has a group of people with separate powers, but everybody needs to have a say as well. And so here's a really good quote here that I'll end with. The best political community is formed by citizens of the middle class. And by middle class, he means like middle people, not necessarily middle-incomed class. Those states are likely to be well administered, in which there is a large middle class, in which each citizens have moderate and sufficient property. For where some possess much and others possess nothing, there may arise an extreme democracy. So when you have a very high oligarchic system with lots of people with lots of things, and a group of people who have nothing, and a very small middle class of people who have sufficient, things tend to get a little dicey. Okay? For where some possess much and others possess nothing, there may arise an extreme democracy or a pure oligarchy. Or a tyranny may develop out of either extreme. Democracies are safer and more permanent than oligarchies because they have a middle class. People who have enough, not too much, not too little, which is more numerous and has a greater share of government. For where there is no middle class and the poor greatly exceed in number, trouble arises and the state soon comes to an end. That's really important to note. And the founders were enlightened people. They read these documents to help form their new government. Aristotle is saying when there is a large middle class, a group of people, large group of people, more middle class people than any other group, they have enough, they don't have too much, and they don't have, they're not in need, they're not wanting. That's going to be a successful system of government. When you have a large group of people who have a lot, have excess, and a group of people who have nothing, those are extremes, and things tend to become perverted into an oligarchic state or even a tyrannical state. So, that's all I wanted to show you guys for now. Please remember to email me if you have any questions. I'm pretty good at emailing you back as soon as I get them or within the day. So I hope this helped. Let me know if you have any questions. You have the reading followed by the quiz and assessment and the 3 discussion posts per topic this week. So have a fantastic week, and I'll see you guys next